Thank you, Effie. Your Eminences, let me begin, as most of us have, by thanking the organizers, Paul, the Angelicum, the Dicastery. This is a magnificent event. I've learned so much already, and I'm honored to be a part of it. My colleague yesterday mentioned that we had hosted a conference at Fordham 3 years ago. Here's the book. I forgot it yesterday. Nicaea and the Future of Christianity. We have about 20 authors in the volume. It's just came out. And my paper today is really about the questions that remain in my mind after the book came out, right? Because there's still so many things to pursue. So I should note from the outset that this will be the sort of paper that is long on questions and short on answers. I'm a little uneasy about this. It's not my preferred method. It stems from the fact that when I was considering what sort of contribution I might make to this august assembly, I kept falling back on a pair of historical details from the Council of Nicaea that I find myself simply unable to ignore. The first is that Nicaea, and frankly, every subsequent ecumenical council, would have been inconceivable without the active support of the Roman emperor. And the second is the fact that the Bishop of Rome played no role in any aspect of the council. All too often, we seem to ignore these facts when we consider the significance of Nicaea or when we attempt to explain the ways in which the council served as a model for subsequent deliberations in the Middle Ages, or how it might continue to serve as a model for us going forward, particularly with respect to the ways in which we address dissenting views within the church or pursue the cause of Christian unity. Perhaps we ignore these factors because the situation is now so different. Today, there is no emperor, and no, Putin does not count. But the Bishop of Rome possesses a global standing unlike any Christian before him. So how do we map this profound change of circumstance onto our efforts to use Nicaea as a guide for the future of the church? What impact do imperial power and papal privilege have when we consider the relevance of Nicaea today? And what role should these elements play when we look into the future? Put another way, what do we believe to be more important for the future of the Nicene legacy? The emperor or the pope? My address will proceed in three parts. I begin by asking a series of hermeneutical questions about the prominence of the emperor and the absence of the pope at Nicaea. In part two, I offer a few short observations about the unanticipated consequences of the church's embrace of imperial structures and the way in which state dependence in the Byzantine period continues to haunt the contemporary church, at least the Orthodox Church. In the final section, I will propose that the future of Nicaea will largely rely on the papacy. So let's begin with the challenge of Constantine's involvement at Nicaea. I don't think I need to remind any of you that Nicaea was as much a political event as it was an ecclesial one. Our best source for Nicaea, of course, is Eusebius, and the majority of his account is an encomiastic summary of Constantine's address to the assembled bishops. One of the peculiarities of Eusebius's account is that it pays so little attention to the theological questions of the council. I realize that for many of you here, the significance of Nicaea lays squarely in its declaration of a common faith. But this is not the way it was understood at the time, at least not by Eusebius. Why is this so? Is it because Eusebius was sympathetic to Arius's position? Is it because we greatly overestimate the centrality of theological questions to the assembled bishops? Or is it because we are misreading Eusebius altogether, failing to understand that his account of the council is that of an imperial propagandist? As such, he kept his narrative focused squarely on Constantine. In the Eastern Christian tradition, of course, there is a long history of reading Constantine's involvement in the council as providential. Even if Constantine wasn't actually considered a saint in the Byzantine Church until much later, and even if no other emperor was venerated as a saint during the entire Byzantine period, there is ample evidence that the Byzantine Church did come to believe that God had worked through Constantine, and the imperial office was itself sacred, even if individual emperors were not. One need look no further than the oldest surviving hymns for the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, which emphasize Constantine's miraculous vision of a cross. The same hymns perpetuate Eusebius's belief that Constantine's success on the battlefield was the direct result of divine intervention. We have to wait until the 10th century until we find an actual hagiography for Constantine. But much like Eusebius, those texts celebrate the emperor's orchestration of Nicaea and promote his reign as the paradigm for all rulers who seek holiness. But if we set aside these legendary accounts and pursue a more historical, critical approach to Constantine's engagement with Christianity, how then are we to think about the connection between the emperor and Nicaea? Indeed, if we accept the view presented by most historians of the period, that Constantine, whatever his faith may have been, exploited the church for his own political advantage, how then do we think about the various achievements at the council, theological or otherwise? We might answer by saying that the imperial involvement at the council was providential, however flawed Constantine may have been. And we might apply that same hermeneutical approach to each of the subsequent ecumenical councils, which were even more imperially orchestrated than Nicaea had been. But if we take that approach, that our Lord used imperial structures and individual emperors despite their flaws, for the promotion of the correct faith, are we not forever committed to a kind of Constantinianism? Are we not bound to declare, as some are now reasserting, that empire is the preferred political context for Christians? If we follow that line of thinking, are we then forced to conclude that the church needs empire, or at the very least the state, in order to build and enforce theological consensus? If, on the other hand, we want to say that the synodal achievements at Nicaea had nothing to do with Constantine, are we not simply ignoring the historical data? Indeed, how do we deal with the fact that there would have been no council without him? No organization, no funding, no enforcement, no dissemination of results. Practically speaking, the reason the council worked was because no bishop could refuse the summons of an emperor. But without the emperor, there would have been no mechanism to coordinate such a diverse and far-flung collection of ecclesial leaders. Since we solved all that, we'll turn to the Pope. What do we know with absolute certainty about papal involvement at Nicaea? The answer is not much. We know that Rome sent 2 legates to the council, and we know that the Roman Church was named in one of the canons as having jurisdiction over the churches of the West. Apart from that, pretty much everything else is conjecture. We might presume that Pope Sylvester was invited to the council, and we can assume that he received news of its decisions, but there is no actual evidence of either. In fact, there is no surviving correspondence, no sermons, no theological treatises, no epigraphical evidence. There is no evidence of Sylvester's tenure at all other than his name. No evidence of any link whatsoever between him and Constantine, even though Constantine spent time in Rome and funded the construction of the original St. Peter's on Vatican Hill during Sylvester's tenure. Centuries later, the engineers of papal authority would, of course, need to incorporate Sylvester into their narratives. Indeed, how could they possibly ignore the pontiff who reigned at the time of Constantine in the Council of Nicaea? One way they did this was to claim that the council sent its decisions to Sylvester for final approval. But there is zero reliable evidence that that actually happened. To my mind, one of the most intriguing Nicene precedents is that Pope Sylvester did not attend in person. As a matter of fact, no pope attended any of the original councils, apart from Pope Vigilius, who was literally dragged there against his will by imperial soldiers. A friend, I'm not going to name him because you all know him, a friend once proposed that the reason the popes personally avoided empire-wide councils was so that they could maintain plausible deniability. If a council went sideways, they could repudiate their legates. But if it went their way, they could still take credit for it. The same friend joked that no modern pope or patriarch was likely to have the courage to do the same thing now. Think about it. Could we imagine a global gathering of bishops without the presence of the pope or the ecumenical patriarch? Nevertheless, Sylvester's absence at Nicaea is not just disruptive to our notions of primacy, it's also a difficult precedent for our desire for synodality. The truth of the matter is that few, if any, of the early councils of the church were truly deliberative and open-minded, which is, I think, what most of us mean when we say we want synodality. In most cases, the early councils were either engineered by the imperial court with predetermined outcomes, or they were regional affairs consisting of like-minded bishops. It may well be the case that Nicaea was more synodal than most other early councils. Indeed, it does not appear that Constantine forced any preconceived verdict on the council, apart from his request for a unified response to Arius and his desire for a common date for Easter. In that sense, it would appear that the bishops really did have the opportunity to build their own constructive consensus. But we should also note that every decision at Nicaea was made by elite male bishops who resided inside the empire. No women, no laymen, no monks, and very, very few bishops from outside the borders of the Roman world, even though a significant percentage of the global Christian population at the time lived elsewhere. We are accustomed to think of the word ecumenical when we say ecumenical councils as a synonym for universal. As I've written elsewhere, the word more likely functioned as a synonym for imperial. So what about the Council of Nicaea and primacy? One of the things that is often neglected in our conversations about Nicaea is the way that it transformed the notion of episcopal jurisdiction, which ultimately created the conditions that enabled the way we now think of primacy. In the 1st and 2nd century, episcopal jurisdiction was conceptualized primarily in terms of the Eucharistic assembly rather than in terms of geography. Thus, there was no functional hierarchy within the episcopate because each bishop was the primate of his own Eucharistic community. The transition from a Eucharist-based jurisdiction to a geographically based jurisdiction began in the 3rd century, largely as a result of the church's growth, but it was the Council of Nicaea that formalized that transition. And it is precisely because Nicaea was an imperial affair that the geographies of episcopal jurisdiction were codified at Nicaea according to pre-existing Roman structures. 7 of Nicaea's 20 canons involve questions of episcopal jurisdiction, and in every single case, the new ecclesial boundaries mirror the Roman provincial network. Even Canon 6, which famously authorizes a super jurisdiction for the sees of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, does so by mapping the church's borders to the tripart Roman provincial organization of the empire according to its territories in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The quick rise in significance of those 3 specific bishops in subsequent legislation and ecclesial politics was tied to their proximity to the centers of imperial power. The claim of Petrine primacy, which did not begin until the 5th century and was created to counter the perceived lack of apostolicity at the See of Constantinople, was very much a rhetorical creation designed to counter Rome's decline in imperial significance vis-a-vis a new Rome in Constantinople. The subsequent and reciprocal invention of the Constantinopolitan Andrew legends was nothing more than a rhetorical response to the Roman Church's Petrine claims. I'm sure that some of you might disagree, but in my assessment, the bishops assembled at Nicaea and those that followed after them in succeeding generations failed to anticipate the long-term problems that the church would face as a result of its almost immediate addiction to imperial support. I will name but not detail the many ways in which the emperors of the Eastern Empire consistently imposed themselves upon the church, often at great cost to the ecclesial institution and individual believers. But continuing with the themes I've already identified, the church-state collaboration that we see in an embryonic form at Nicaea established trajectories that have become something of an albatross for the church, at least on the Orthodox side of things. Let's look, for example, at the simple matter of the convening of an ecumenical council. While it is true that the church benefited from the empire's organization and funding of each of the ecumenical councils, as well as dozens of other councils we don't call ecumenical, functionally speaking, the church has historically needed an emperor to convene a synod, and this simple fact has proven to be an insurmountable obstacle to a gathering of a full pan-Orthodox synod in the post-Byzantine world. Without the reach of an emperor whose summons no bishop could resist, the modern church is simply incapable of forcing everyone to the table to discuss urgent matters. And while it is true that the Roman Catholic Church surely has avoided this particular problem because of the Roman bishop's functional primacy, I'm not so sure whether or not my friends in the Roman Church have fully come to terms with the fact that their pontiffs have, over the centuries, effectively played the role of the emperor at Nicaea. I don't think I need to remind any of you that the title Pontifex Maximus, a very popular medieval title for the papacy, was created by Augustus Caesar and employed by Constantine. Another important precedent of Nicaea that we tend to overlook, but one that has had multiple deleterious ramifications in the modern Orthodox Church, is the extent to which Nicaea was effectively an event for the bishops of the empire only. While it is likely that 2 or 3 bishops from outside the empire attended the assembly, the deliberations and canons were focused exclusively on internal concerns. This is most evident in the way that the canons presume Roman structures. To my mind, this raises at least 2 important questions for the present and future church. First, Can we honestly look to Nicaea as a precedent for thinking about Christianity in global terms when it was so demonstrably a Roman event? And second, to what extent does the Romanness of the Synod provide a precedent for those who agitate for religious nationalism? Given the multi-ethnic and multinational reach of their jurisdictions, I would say that both the Roman Pontiff and the Ecumenical Patriarch can serve as important counterweights to the threat of religious nationalism. But I think we can all agree that there are active forces within the Catholic and Orthodox traditions that would seek to limit rather than expand the Church's global character and global diversity. Returning to my opening question, what is more important for the future of Nicaea, an emperor of the Pope? I will conclude briefly by saying that the answer is, of course, the Pope. But I do have a few caveats. By saying that the future of Nicaea needs the papacy more than an emperor, I am not reinterpreting or ignoring what happened. It is demonstrably clear that the original Nicaea was an imperial affair, even if the bishops were given some latitude to build an administrative and theological consensus. It is equally clear that the papacy was a non-factor at Nicaea. But our faith is not static, nor are our institutions. The future of Nicaea does not require an ill-conceived recreation of a mythical past. It requires a dynamic, living commitment to the gospel that is as much in dialogue with the world as it is in dialogue with the tradition of Nicaea. To my mind, we will never truly honor Nicaea, nor will we achieve any sort of authentic unity without historical honesty. A step into the future requires an honest accounting of the past, and this includes an acknowledgement of past wrongs and a setting aside of pious fictions. If we are to build on the spirit of Nicaea, its synodality, its theological consensus, its desire for a common liturgical calendar, and if we are to pursue the path of Christian unity, we must be truthful in our narration of Christian history, of papal history, of patriarchal history. The continued perpetuation of a mythical purity, whether at Nicaea or elsewhere in the early church, is no better than the idolatry promoted by fundamentalists. Among other things, this means that we must have the courage to speak honestly about the flaws within our institutions. In short, we must speak the truth about the past if we are to build on the consensus of Nicaea and advance the gospel. Thank you.